Story 1. Somebody used my camp. I was awake, but not because anything was wrong yet. That's the part I keep coming back to. I wasn't jolted awake by screaming or footsteps or some movie thing. I was awake because when I sleep outside, especially in cold weather, I wake up every few hours automatically and check the setup in my head like a checklist. Tarp tension, ridgeline sag, ground insulation, stove fuel, water filter inside the bag so it doesn't freeze. That's just how I am now. I do 1 week every November somewhere like this, somewhere deep in the Virginia Appalachians beyond an old logging closure. I use that week to test emergency shelter setups and cold weather gear before winter hiking season really starts. I've done it long enough that most of it is muscle memory. I know what wet socks feel like when you hang them too close to a fire. I know how fast fog settles in low places after sundown. I know what a deer sounds like when it brushes through leaf litter versus a raccoon versus a person who thinks he's being quiet. And before anybody starts assigning ghosts to hardwood trees, no. I don't buy into that stuff. People like to turn these mountains into a campfire story because they're old and big and it's easy to project things into the dark when you're underprepared. That's always been my position. Preparation is what matters. Routine is what matters. If you know where your gear is, if you know your exit route, if you know the weather window and you don't do stupid macho nonsense, the woods are just woods. That attitude got a lot sharper after the accident. A few years before this happened, I got hit on the highway by a truck that jackknifed in freezing rain. I don't remember the full impact, just the sideways feeling and the sound of my own car sliding somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. Then glass, then being pinned wrong. I lived, obviously, but afterward I had a real problem with unpredictability. Not in a dramatic way. I still worked, still drove, still did normal life. I just stopped tolerating loose ends. I wanted backup plans for backup plans. I wanted everything in rows, labeled, charged, zipped, accounted for. After the crash, routine became the only thing that made the world feel predictable again. So a solo week in the woods actually calmed me down. It sounds backwards to some people, but when I'm out there alone with a system, I know what depends on me and what doesn't. No traffic, no strangers changing lanes without looking, no random phone calls, just weather, terrain, and whether I packed enough dry socks. That year I was testing a new winter tarp system, a low-profile setup I'd put together for late-season hiking, and I wanted miserable conditions on purpose. Not dangerous, just annoying. Cold rain, wet ground, freezing fog. Good conditions for seeing what fails and what doesn't. I had motion alarms, backup batteries, vacuum-sealed food packs, a waterproof notebook for coordinates and gear notes, and enough layered redundancy to make most people roll their eyes. I know how that sounds. A middle-aged guy disappearing into the woods in late November with sensors and tripwire alarms, like I'm preparing for the end of the world. Fine. From the outside, I probably looked like a guy who'd gotten one survival forum membership too many. But I knew my reasons. The access road had already turned to mud where the state had seasonally closed the forestry spur after heavy rain. I parked where I legally could, shouldered my pack, and hiked in about 2 miles from there. Not straight uphill, but enough rolling terrain and slick leaves to make me pay attention to my footing. By the time I cut onto the abandoned logging spur, I had tiny pebbles stuck inside my boot heel from the road and that irritating shifting scrape every few steps. I remember stopping once just to shake one boot out and finding 3 pebbles and a dead piece of grass in there. I passed an old fire ring not long after, one of those blackened circles people leave behind even when they know better. Around it, the forest floor looked strange if you stopped and studied it, but not strange enough to set off anything in me yet. There were flattened patches of earth nearby, too rectangular to be natural, almost like somebody had laid gear out there recently and then packed up. Leaves had been pushed aside in long, narrow shapes, clean little rectangles in the wet, brown mess. I figured somebody had dragged equipment through there not long before me. Hunters, maybe. Another camper trying to keep things organized. It was a closed logging section, but that doesn't mean nobody ever slips in. I made a mental note and kept moving. By the time I picked my actual campsite, it was late enough that the fog had started collecting low between the ridges. I set up beside a bend in a creek because I wanted water access and a natural sound break. The whole place smelled like sour, wet leaves trapped under cold fog. If you've spent time in hardwood forest after rain, you know that smell. Not fresh leaf smell, not that nice fall postcard smell. Older than that, damp and tannic and a little bit rotten. I pitched the tarp low and tight, checked the angle twice, then hung my food bags well away from the sleeping area, even though I also had hard-sided storage in camp. I logged GPS coordinates in my waterproof notebook in small block letters because I print more carefully when it's cold. I made a note about the creek bend, the wind direction, and how the ground held water under the top layer of leaves. My gloves were damp by then, hanging near the fire to dry. And they had that warm rubber smell wet hiking gloves get when they're close to heat but not dry yet. I cooked instant rice in a dented pot while the weather radio hissed static heavy updates that kept fading in and out depending on how I held the antenna. Nothing dramatic, just the usual mention of low temperatures and lingering precipitation. It actually felt good being there. That's another part that bothers me now. I was starting to settle. I remember sitting on my folded foam pad with the pot in my hands, steam on my face, and thinking that the whole point of the week was working. My head had been loud for months. That night it got quiet. I wrote a few more notes. I sorted tomorrow's layers. I noticed a packet of powdered apple cider leaking inside one of my side pouches and got annoyed because the sugary dust had worked itself into the zipper seam. I cleaned that up with the stupid level of care I apply to things because that's what I do. Before sleeping, I walked the perimeter and tested the tripwire alarms around camp. Nothing fancy, just enough to let me know if something larger than a squirrel moved through. I checked the creek edge, checked the tote latches, checked the food hang, then got in under the tarp and listened to the constant soft hiss of condensation dripping from the tarp edges overnight. That sound stayed steady enough to become background. I slept. The first thing that bothered me happened at dawn. I unzipped the bivvy enough to look out and saw my folding saw sitting neatly beside the fire ring. Not dropped, not kicked there, set there. Closed, wiped mostly clean, almost centered on one of the flat stones. The problem was I remembered locking it inside a storage tote before bed. I stood there in my socks for a second just looking at it, with cold mud creeping through the fabric, and I actually said out loud, "No, I didn't." Like if I said it with enough certainty the memory would line back up. I might be wrong about whether the saw was beside the fire ring or the cooler first, but I know it moved. That's exactly how I remember thinking it because I started replaying the sequence from the night before in my head. Stove off, pot rinsed, gloves moved, saw back in the tote, lid latched, or had I set it down while adjusting the fire ring and planned to put it away after the perimeter check? I had hiked in freezing rain most of the previous afternoon. I was tired, I was cold. It was entirely plausible I misremembered one small thing and then woke up acting like the woods had rearranged themselves on purpose. So I picked the saw up, checked it, put it back where it belonged, and moved on. That's the thing about people who spend time outside alone. Experience is mostly a long process of talking yourself down from bad assumptions. If you panic every time something doesn't line up, you wear yourself out. I told myself that, made coffee, and went about the morning. I walked the creek. I checked for animal sign. I found more of those oddly clean narrow patches in the leaves a little farther from camp, like somebody had swept away the top layer in strips, but even then I took it as evidence of previous use, not anything active. I stayed busy because busy is stabilizing. The second day was wet and gray and slow. I spent part of it adjusting the tarp height, part of it processing a bit of deadfall, part of it sitting under cover with the weather radio and my notebook while fog drifted between the trees in torn sheets. I ate badly, which is normal on gear testing trips, and wrote down which gloves stayed warmest after getting soaked. By evening, I had that calm tiredness you get from repetitive outdoor chores. Then one of the tripwire alarms went off, just a short electronic burst from the downslope side of camp. I stood up immediately, listening. Nothing followed it. No crashing through brush, no snort, no scramble. I grabbed my light and walked the perimeter. Nothing. I reset it, checked the line, scanned the trees, and went back to the fire. 10 minutes later, it went off again. Same area, still nothing. A deer can slip off fast if it hears you moving. A black bear, rare enough there that I wasn't especially worried, would usually leave sign. I found neither. The leaves were wet enough to show disturbance, but all I had were my own prints and muddled impressions from earlier movement around camp. Later down by the creek, I saw boot prints overlapping mine in a patch of soft mud. The print pattern wasn't mine, different sole. But what bothered me was that I couldn't find a clean set leading in. It was like they began where the bank widened, crossed over my own tracks, then blurred back into them. I crouched there longer than I needed to, one hand on my knee, staring like the mud was going to explain itself if I gave it time. I kept trying to convince myself the accident had made me overly controlling about small details. That's true. It had. And I knew it, which made it harder, not easier, because every odd thing had two possible explanations. Either something was wrong, or I was once again trying to force the world into straight lines because I couldn't stand loose pieces. That night, I opened the storage tote for dinner and found one of my vacuum-sealed meal packets already opened and partially eaten. I mean cleanly opened, not gnawed. The top edge was peeled back. A corner of the contents was gone. The rest sat there, collapsed in on itself. I examined the seal for punctures, for tooth marks, for anything. Nothing. If a mouse had gotten into it, where was the damage? If I had somehow opened it myself and forgotten, why would I have put it back in the tote like that? I still rationalized it. I actually stood there in the cold telling myself maybe mice had gotten through somehow despite no puncture holes. Maybe I'd torn it while sorting food. Maybe the vacuum seal had failed and I'd handled it half asleep. The explanations were getting worse, and I knew they were getting worse, but I was still offering them up because the alternative was admitting someone had been in my camp, inside my gear while I was there or asleep. And then I found cigarette ashes inside my tarp vestibule, not outside by the fire ring, not near the old ring-up trail. Inside the vestibule on the ground sheet edge where I kept my boots. Gray flakes, a couple darker crumbs, a faint stale smoke smell buried under the wet earth smell. I just stared at them. I should have left the second I found ashes inside my tarp instead of treating it like a puzzle. Instead, I did what I always do when I don't want to admit something is getting away from me. I turned it into a problem to solve. I checked the tarp lines for tampering. I checked the zippers. I checked the tote latches again. I checked my notebook and then checked it again because one corner looked bent differently, and I couldn't even tell if that was real or me being ridiculous. My jaw was so tight it hurt. Then I did something that in the moment felt embarrassingly reasonable. I decided this was probably another camper or a hunter quietly using the same general area who had gotten too close out of either carelessness or curiosity. Maybe he'd seen my setup. Maybe he'd waited until I was down by the creek. Maybe he ducked under the vestibule lip out of the rain and flicked ash without thinking. Inconvenient, rude, not good, but human. Human meant solvable. Human meant I wasn't inside some story with no rules. I even felt relief. Not full relief, but enough that my shoulders loosened a little. Enough that I made myself tea and wrote a note in my waterproof notebook about moving camp in the morning if the overlap continued. Enough that I thought with actual annoyance more than fear that I'd ended up near some antisocial jerk who didn't understand boundaries. That was the false resolution, I guess. The point where I believed I had the correct category. Not supernatural, not impossible, just another person being weird in the woods. I could handle weird. I've handled injured hikers, unexpected storms, drunks on public sites, one guy with a handgun who wanted to debate calibers at midnight. Human was manageable. The next morning I was stiff and underslept, but clear-headed. I repacked some gear, tightened the food hang, and decided I'd walk a wider loop before choosing whether to relocate. The fog hadn't lifted much. Everything was wet. Condensation dripped off the tarp edges in that same soft hiss, and every now and then a drop hit the hood of my jacket with a sharper tick. I noticed there were no new ashes, no new obvious disturbances. The ordinary look of camp was almost enough to make me feel stupid. Then I heard movement downslope, not close, not crashing, just that unmistakable stop-and-go sound of something large moving through wet leaves and pausing. I called out once, calm voice, something like, "Hey, if somebody's camped nearby, I'm just checking the area." No answer. I left most of my gear where it was and started toward the sound, angling back in the direction of the access road because I figured if somebody was illegally using the closed spur, that's where he'd be tucked. It wasn't a long walk, less than 100 yards maybe. But the brush thickened in a way that hid distance, and the ground there dipped enough that my own camp disappeared behind a screen of saplings and deadfall. Then I saw the netting. Camouflage netting, low and dark and slick with moisture, strung between trees in a way that blended into the understory until I was nearly on top of it. Under that was a second campsite. Not old, not abandoned, used. There were empty food cans stacked inside a milk crate, a tarp lean-to lower than mine, a plastic tote with one cracked corner, a sleeping pad, a pair of boots. Everything arranged with the kind of practical tidiness that made my stomach go hollow. Because this wasn't someone passing through, this was someone established. And then I saw the pages. They were clipped together under a stone on a crate lid, several copied pages torn from my waterproof notebook. Same grid paper, same smudges where my pencil had pressed hard. Same entries, or what looked like my entries, written out by hand, coordinates, weather notes, gear comments. I flipped one page and felt all the blood leave my face. Mixed in with the copied notes were entries I hadn't written yet that morning in my own notebook. Or more accurately, versions of what I would later discover were missing from mine. A line about the meal packet. A line about ashes in the vestibule. Things I know I had not written before walking down slope. I know that sounds impossible. I'm aware of that. But I didn't make those notes until later. Or until I thought later. That part is the one that won't sit still in my head. On top of the papers was a stack of Polaroids. Every single one showed my camp. Not from the road, not from some distant ridge with a zoom lens. From close. From angles that meant the person holding the camera had been inside or right at the edge of my sight while I was there. One showed me asleep under the tarp, my face turned toward the bivvy opening, one hand outside the bag. Another showed my gloves hanging near the fire, the damp rubber smell of them practically coming back into my nose just seeing that image. Another had my food bags in the background and the leaking apple cider packet on a log where I'd set it while cleaning the pouch. One showed me adjusting tarp lines earlier that same morning. Same jacket, same fog, same position I'd been in after breakfast. I froze with those photographs in my hand. I don't mean I hesitated heroically while deciding what to do. I mean my body stopped cooperating. My knees locked. My mouth went dry so fast it hurt. I could hear the creak somewhere off to the left and a drop hitting the netting above me in an irregular little patter, and my own breathing sounding too loud in a space that wasn't mine. Then one of my motion alarms sounded back at my original camp. A sharp electronic burst through the trees. I remember looking up toward the direction of my sight and feeling that instant sick calculation hit me. If the alarm was going off now while I was standing in this hidden camp, then someone was back there. Maybe the person who lived here. Maybe someone else. But someone was in my camp while I was not, and suddenly every ordinary object I owned felt contaminated. Sleeping bag, notebook, food, my house key in the top pouch, the inside of my tarp. The way somebody had already handled all of it without my knowledge. I dropped the photographs. Or maybe I set them down and then bolted. I genuinely don't know. What I do know is I backed out first because for half a second I couldn't make myself turn my back on that lean-to. Then I turned and moved uphill too fast, sliding on wet leaves, catching myself on saplings, hearing my breath come ragged in the cold. I didn't go back through camp in any organized way. I came in from the side, saw one tote open and my tarp edge moving slightly, maybe from breeze, maybe not, and that was enough. I grabbed my keys, my jacket, my notebook, and one dry bag with my wallet and phone. I left the rest, stove, food, extra layers, half the alarm kit, all of it. I got to the truck after dark. By then my hands were shaking so badly I had to brace the key against the steering column twice before I could get it in. The cracked skin on my knuckles had split from cold and mud and left little brown streaks on the wheel. When the heater finally started blowing, it smelled like dust and old coolant, and that stupid ordinary smell almost made me lose it. I drove to the ranger station because it was the only official place still open along the way. I probably looked unhinged, soaked and filthy, and trying to explain copied notebook pages to two forestry officers who already had the expression of men bracing for another weird late-season complaint. To their credit, they did take the location. They followed up. But the explanation I got from them, and the explanation that stayed, was that hidden squatters or illegal hunters had probably been occupying closed forest sections along the logging spur for months without anybody noticing. That, on paper, fits a lot of it. The secret camp, the food cans, the photographs. Somebody covertly using the closure, keeping an eye on anyone who wandered in. Searches recovered the hidden campsite, but nobody was found nearby, and several photographs disappeared before evidence was cataloged fully. That last part was delivered to me in the tone institutions use when they want you to accept that a thing happened, and also understand nobody intends to do anything more about it. Lost in handling, misplaced, unclear chain, no arrests made. I went back once, weeks later, not alone and not to camp, just to see what remained. Almost nothing. Disturbed leaves, a stain where a crate had sat, some cordage, the kind of absence that feels deliberate. The rational explanation is simple enough. Isolated trespassers were secretly monitoring campers using abandoned logging roads. Maybe they stole, maybe they watched. Maybe they liked the power of entering occupied camps without being caught. People do stranger things than that. You don't need anything beyond human behavior to account for the hidden site and the photographs. What I can't get around are the notebook pages. Because pages from my notebook appeared copied before I had even written some entries later discovered missing. I've gone over every possible version. Maybe I wrote those lines earlier than I think and forgot. Maybe I drafted them in shorthand and only later believed I was composing them fresh. Maybe whoever copied them had access at a different time than I understood. I keep trying to assemble it into something boring, something procedural, something that belongs in a police report and not in the back corner of my head. It never stays there. I still camp, though not like I used to. I don't do closed road spots anymore, and I don't stay where I can't get out fast. At home, I used to sleep with the bedroom curtains open because I liked early light. I don't do that now. I keep blackout curtains permanently closed even in summer because if I wake up and see a window uncovered beside the bed, I can't stop thinking about what might already be standing on the other side of it. Some people spend years trying to understand what they saw out there. Others decide very quickly that understanding isn't really the point. The next story feels like that. Not because it explains anything, but because sometimes what stays with the family isn't the event itself. It's the part everyone waved off until it was too late to wave off anymore. Story 2. The Lantern Beyond Trees. This didn't happen to me directly, which I know makes some people tune out, but I'm the one who ended up with the tapes, and after listening to all of them, I don't know how else to tell it except straight. My mother downsized a bunch of family storage boxes a couple of years ago and handed me a plastic tote that had belonged to my grandfather. Old receipts, hunting tags, 2 pocket knives that barely opened anymore, and a stack of cassette tapes with his handwriting on them in fading marker. Weather notes, shack repairs, trail camera checks, stuff like that. He used to record himself during hunting season because, according to him, it helped him keep details straight. According to the rest of us at the time, it was one more eccentric old man habit to laugh at. He hunted alone every autumn on family property somewhere out in the Kentucky Appalachian hunting land my family no longer visits. Overgrown place, narrow ATV trails, an abandoned deer shack, thick pines along the edge of reclaimed strip mining land. He liked it because he hated crowded public hunting areas and because he was stubborn enough that if other people said a place was inconvenient, he'd treat that as a recommendation. When his memory started slipping in the last few years of his life, he told the same stories over and over. Most of us smiled through it. I didn't always. That's the part I hate admitting. I spent years assuming he exaggerated things because admitting he was genuinely afraid felt harder. It was easier to tell myself he liked attention or that he wanted people to fuss over him than to sit with the possibility that he had actually been trying to describe something that unsettled him. So when I started listening to the tapes, I expected mostly weather and old man commentary. And at first, that's what it was. On the earliest recording from that season, he's driving in, and you can hear the truck suspension squeak every time he hits a rut. There's a cracked yellow thermos lid rattling in the cup holder the whole time, tapping plastic in this annoying little rhythm. He mentions the sky looking bad for evening rain, says the wind's already up, then offhandedly says he spotted a lantern moving through the trees far down slope after dark the night before. Just like that. Casual. Then he immediately moves on to trail conditions. He assumes it's another hunter crossing property lines and keeps recording weather notes normally. That alone wouldn't matter. People trespass. People cut across private land. If anything, his tone made it sound ordinary. Most of the next recordings are almost painfully normal. He talks to himself while brewing coffee on a propane stove inside the deer shack. You can hear the stove hiss and the faint clink of the metal cup against the burner grate. The shack itself had this smell I remember from childhood visits, stale peppermint gum and damp plywood and the sharp mix of pine sap and rusted metal roofing heating up when the sun hit it. I know that smell exactly because I'd open the door and it would come out all at once. On one tape, he's repairing a loose sheet of plywood while the wind keeps rattling old roofing nails overhead. Hollow knocking sounds from dead branches hitting trunks outside come in and out under his voice. He jokes to himself about squirrels stealing bait corn and says if he catches one with his own hands, he'll make it pay rent. On another tape, he complains about mud dried hard onto his suspenders near the cuffs because he stepped wrong near the lower trail. There are whole stretches where he's just narrating where he put things, how many deer tracks he counted near the clearing, whether the coffee tastes burnt. That normality is what gets to me now. It sounds like a man alone doing familiar tasks, a little talkative because no one's around to interrupt him, but comfortable. You can hear the routine in him. The way he opens the shack door, the way he sets the recorder down, the scrape of a chair leg over floorboards. Nothing dramatic. Then several nights later, the lantern comes up again. This time he records it as if he's trying not to make too much of it. He says it's there between two pine trunks, much closer than before and completely still, not swinging, not moving, not just sitting at a height that seemed wrong for being carried unless somebody was standing there holding it very carefully. He notes there are no footsteps and no voices. Then, almost like he's embarrassed even on his own tape, he says it could still just be some illegal camper nearby who's noticed him first and is waiting to see what he'll do. His voice has that careful casualness people use when they don't want to sound rattled, the kind where the sentence is doing more work than it should. Part of me still worries I'm projecting meaning onto an old man's fear after the fact. I really do worry about that. I listen to these tapes knowing how his last years went, knowing what I brushed aside, so I don't want to turn every pause into evidence. But even with that in mind, the progression is hard to ignore. He keeps seeing the lantern, not every tape, but enough. Each time it's a little nearer. First downslope through the trees, then closer to the ATV trail. Then near the clearing where one of his trail cameras is mounted. He never reacts big, that's what stands out. He reacts like someone who does not want to be the kind of person who makes a scene over uncertain things. He says maybe it's poachers, maybe a neighbor's relative, maybe someone trying not to get caught on the property. He says at one point that calling anybody before he's sure would make him look foolish. And I can hear him almost talking himself into that embarrassment. Another tape later has him inside the shack after midnight. He isn't speaking at first. You just hear wind through dead branches and the old roof ticking. Then a soft cough outside the wall. Not loud, not theatrical, human and close. He goes quiet so long I thought the tape had ended. Then he whispers, almost irritated, "If you're out there, you can say what you want." Nobody answers. He nearly contacts wardens after that, I think. Or at least he thinks about it enough to mention it twice. But he never does because he's worried the neighbors will hear about it and laugh. Or the wardens will come out and find nothing and he'll be the old guy getting jumpy in his shack over another hunter cutting through. That sounds small until you hear it in context. His whole delay sits inside not wanting to look ridiculous. By the final tape, that restraint is gone. It starts abruptly, recorder already running, and he's breathing hard enough that the microphone keeps clipping. Things are scraping, plastic on wood, metal knocking. It took me a second to understand he was barricading the shack door with feed buckets. He whispers that the lantern is hanging from a branch less than 20 feet outside. You can hear the wind, hear the loose roofing overhead, hear something metallic squeak once from outside like a hook or chain under weight. Then his footsteps, then the faint rough sound of him shifting the door open just a fraction. And then he stops. There are maybe 3 seconds on that tape that I have replayed too many times. No voices, no attack, nothing overt. Just the sound outside changing and him taking in air through his nose like he forgot how to do it normally. Then he says very quietly, "No." A second later, the recorder catches that same metal squeak again, but farther back somehow, and then he says, "There's another one." He doesn't sound dramatic, he sounds stunned, like his mind is trying to place what his eyes are telling him and failing. After that, he whispers, "There's 2 of them now." Then the tape clicks off. That's it. No big ending, no explanation, no chase. The family stopped letting him hunt alone after that season, which at the time I thought was overprotective and slightly insulting to him. Now I don't. I think he was trying as hard as he could to describe a situation that didn't give him enough to report cleanly. Later, local wardens suggested trespassers or meth cooks sometimes used reclaimed mining property for hidden camps and didn't want landowners or hunters nearby. Several trail cameras from neighboring properties reportedly vanished around the same time. So there is a rational explanation. A strong one, honestly. Coordinated trespassers trying to intimidate people away from remote sections make sense of the lanterns, the moved camera, the coughing outside the wall, even the way nothing escalated into direct confrontation. It fits human behavior better than anything else. And the warden's position stayed there. Hidden camps near the reclaimed sections, no suspects identified. End of story officially. I should have listened more carefully when he tried explaining why he stopped hunting alone. Instead, I nodded the way people do when they think they're humoring somebody. I hate that I can hear on those tapes exactly where he wanted someone to take him seriously, and probably understood nobody really was. There was one more thing in the tote with the cassettes. A developed photograph, loose between two paper envelopes. The image shows the shack window from outside, with one lantern clearly reflected in the glass and another deeper in the woods. Maybe there's some ordinary explanation in the lens, in the flash, in the angle. That's the explanation I keep returning to because most of the rest supports hidden trespassers trying to scare him off. But what never fits is that the second lantern appears in the photograph at an angle impossible from the camera position. I've tested it against the window frame and the tree line in the picture more times than I want to admit. I keep that photograph buried beneath unrelated family documents in a desk drawer. And when I open that drawer for something else, I still make sure I don't look at it longer than I have to. When a story gets handed down instead of lived, it changes shape. Not softer, usually. Just stranger. The last one starts in the middle of the worst part, which maybe is the only honest way some people can tell these things. By the time they try to explain how they got there, the thing that's already happened has colored every detail that came before it. Story 3. The noise outside my tent. Something was touching the outside of my tent near my feet, not hitting it, not brushing past, dragging. Slow, deliberate fingertips across wet nylon back and forth in short strokes, the way somebody might test the texture of fabric in a store, except there was nothing casual about it. Every time the fingers moved, tiny droplets shaken from the tent wall slid downward and tapped onto my sleeping bag. Outside, measured footsteps kept circling through wet leaves. Crunch, pause. Crunch, pause. Never hurrying, never close enough for me to tell exactly where the person was unless they passed near the head of the tent. It was so dark I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed unless I blinked hard. My phone was dead in the pack pocket because of course it was, and my flashlight was beside my head under the lip of my sleeping bag, close enough that I could reach it but not without moving. I lay there completely still with the warm mildew smell trapped inside the wet sleeping bag pressing into my nose. And all I could think was, you should not be here for a third night. Because I already knew something was wrong. Not movie wrong, not monster wrong, just wrong in a way I had been refusing to categorize because once I categorized it, I had to admit I had stayed. I had already spent 2 nights hearing movement nearby and should have left long before this moment. The fingers dragged once more along the tent fabric, lower this time, then stopped. I could hear tiny water droplets constantly falling from leaves onto the tent, a soft scatter over the rainfly, and behind that, breathing. Slow, human breathing. Inches from where the pole bent near my shins, my whole mouth tasted metallic. I had one hand around the flashlight and the other locked so hard around the sleeping bag edge my knuckles hurt. I told myself not to move, then told myself moving was the only chance I had, then told myself maybe if I stayed quiet, whoever it was would think the tent was empty, which is obviously ridiculous because there was a person-sized shape in it, and I'd been in there for hours. I need to back up. A few weeks before this, I had dropped out of graduate school and then spent several days not telling anybody the full truth. Then several more days not answering calls. Then a couple weeks pretending I just needed time to think. Really, I felt like I'd stepped out of the life everybody expected me to finish and suddenly had no skin left. Every conversation made me feel smaller. Every text from family felt like it arrived preloaded with disappointment, whether they meant it that way or not. I felt like I'd disappointed everybody badly enough that disappearing for a while seemed easier. So I threw camping gear into my car, drove south without much of a plan, and ended up somewhere deep in the North Carolina Appalachians past a trail closure most people ignored. It wasn't supposed to be some grand healing trip. I wasn't trying to find myself. I just wanted a place where nobody could ask me what I was doing next. At the trailhead, or what passed for one, there was a ranger board with maps under plastic and a bunch of old notices stapled beneath it. A few of them were missing pet flyers, weather-faded and curling at the corners. Pictures gone almost white from sun and rain. Dog names. A cat, maybe. I barely looked. They seemed outdated enough to be part of the board itself. I parked, packed too much, and hiked in. The campsite I picked was primitive and farther out than most people wanted to bother with because the footbridge on the main route had washed out months earlier. You could still get beyond it if you were willing to scramble the creek rocks and not mind slick footing. After that, it was another stretch through dense rhododendron tunnels and narrow sections cut along steep ravines. Beautiful in a way that stops feeling peaceful once the light starts going. At the time, though, it felt perfect. Remote enough to be left alone. Humid midsummer air. Everything still wet from nightly rainstorms, creek noise constant in the low places. I set up beside the water because I liked hearing it, and because there was just enough flat ground there for my little tent if I cleared sticks first. I cooked boxed macaroni on a stove balanced over flat rocks, stirring with a camping spoon that still had powdered cheese residue caked around the handle from me not rinsing it properly the first time. Cicadas screamed in the trees. My damp athletic socks were drying on a line near the creek, and that smell kept drifting back every time the air shifted. I had a flashlight propped beside my journal while I wrote, not anything profound, just messy half-thoughts and practical notes about mileage and how my knees felt. Rainwater dripped steadily from rhododendron leaves onto the tent all evening. A sticky patch of pine sap on the tent zipper pull kept catching on my thumb every time I opened and closed it. That first night almost worked. That's the worst part. I started to feel the tiniest bit less raw. I remember writing one sentence in the journal about how being somewhere uncomfortable on purpose felt better than sitting at home waiting for people to ask careful questions. Which is such an annoying sentence in retrospect because it sounds like I thought I was doing something brave when really I was just avoiding my life in a prettier location. Sometime near midnight, I heard 3 slow knocks against a distant tree trunk uphill from camp, evenly spaced. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. Then nothing. No animal movement afterward, which registered before I knew why it registered. The cicadas had stopped, the frogs by the creek too. Just for a few seconds, but in a way that made the silence feel cut out instead of natural. I honestly can't remember whether the knocking came in 3s or 4s the first night. I lay there listening for it again and building explanations the way anxious people do. Someone splitting damp firewood awkwardly in the dark beyond the ravine. Somebody setting up camp late and banging gear against a trunk. The sound carried weirdly. Woods do that, and once I had an explanation, even a flimsy one, I held on to it because I wanted sleep more than certainty. The next morning there was no obvious sign of anything. I made coffee badly. I rinsed out the macaroni pot. I sat on a rock and watched creek foam catch on roots. I remember feeling stupid for how much the knocks had bothered me. Like my brain had started assigning significance to random noise because stress had turned every sense up too high. Most of the day after that was quiet. I hiked a bit farther, came back, read half of a paperback without absorbing much, and generally tried to be a person on a normal solo trip instead of somebody hiding from phone calls in the woods. By late afternoon, I almost convinced myself I was settling in. Then I noticed muddy shoe prints crossing directly through my camp. Not toward the tent, not toward the food bag hung between two trees, not toward the stove or the pack or the little pile of things someone would actually want if they were snooping. They just crossed through, heel to toe, from one side of camp to the other, as if whoever made them had chosen the exact line that would pass closest to everything without approaching anything. I stood there staring at them with my toothbrush in one hand, because I had been about to brush my teeth by the creek. They were too defined to be mine from the day before. Different tread, fresh enough that the mud still looked dark at the edges. At the time, I thought maybe stress and sleep deprivation were making every sound feel loaded with meaning. So naturally, I tested that theory by continuing to stay there, because apparently my best skill that week was finding a bad option and polishing it until it looked like resilience. That same day later, I found my cooking pot rinsed clean and upside down beside the creek. I had left it dirty. I know I had. Cheese film, pasta starch, all of it. I had specifically decided to deal with it later because I was tired and there wasn't enough light left to do a proper wash without dropping it into the water. Now it sat upside down on a flat rock with no residue inside. That was the first moment I felt my stomach drop in a way I couldn't talk over. Somebody had handled something of mine, not stolen it, not broken it, not even moved it far, cleaned it. That's somehow worse, or it was to me. It felt intimate in this gross, unnecessary way, like someone had inserted themselves into the small private routine of my campsite just to prove they could. I started packing then, not fully but enough to make leaving easier. Rolled one sleeping pad strap, put the headlamp where I could reach it, checked the trail out in my head. Then evening came, and with it that cowardly, embarrassing thought that if I hiked out now, I would be quitting one more thing. Not school, not my future, obviously, but my brain folded them together anyway. Leave camp early, fail again. Overreact, prove you're unstable, stay one more night, show yourself you can handle discomfort. I should have left after finding footprints in camp instead of treating another night there like some kind of test. Instead, I made dinner, barely ate it, and sat in the dark pretending I was being measured about the whole thing. The knocking returned after full dark, much closer this time, not distant uphill, nearby. Same even intervals, like a rhythm rather than work. I crouched beside the tent entrance, listening hard enough that my ears hurt. After the third set of knocks, a flashlight beam threaded through the trees for maybe 1 second. Narrow, white, low to the ground, then gone instantly. Not sweeping around, not searching, just there, then not there. I called out and my voice came out thinner than I meant it to. Something like, "Hey, are you on the trail?" No answer. The animal sounds kept doing that impossible feeling stop every time distant branches cracked uphill. Not a gradual fade, not one species quieting and then another. Everything cutting out for a few seconds at once, then returning. It felt mechanical, like somebody lowering and raising a volume slider on the forest. I didn't sleep much that second night. By dawn, I had pretty much decided I was hiking out. Then I made coffee, the sun came up, and daylight did what daylight always does. It turned everything into something explainable. Wet tents, birds, humidity, too much imagination, some rude camper moving through the area. I stayed. That decision sat behind me all day like a second person. I tried to act normal. I filtered water. I rewrote a journal page because the first one had gotten damp. I aired out gear. I remember being weirdly fixated on cleaning the powdered cheese off the camping spoon because there wasn't enough to do with my hands. The weather got heavy and sticky by late afternoon. The whole camp smelled like wet leaves and creekstone and fabric that would never fully dry. When full dark came again, I got into the tent earlier than usual, zipped everything up, put the flashlight where I could grab it, listened. Which brings me back to where this started. The fingers on the tent, the circling footsteps, the breathing. At some point, the footsteps stopped near my head, then moved away, then came back to my feet again. It wasn't random. It had the measured quality of someone seeing how much they could do before I'd react. Every few minutes, something would press lightly against the tent wall, then release. Not enough to collapse it. Just enough to make me visualize exactly how thin that layer was between me and whoever stood outside. I kept making plans and rejecting them. Scream. No, bad idea if they're close. Stay silent. No, if they come in, you're trapped. Hit the flashlight and run. To where? Through rhododendron tunnels in the dark with no shoes on. I could feel my pulse in my face. My calves kept twitching like they wanted to bolt before the rest of me agreed. Then the pressure changed. Something leaned hard enough onto the tent near my face that the pole structure bowed inward with a soft fiberglass creak. The wet fabric dimpled less than a foot from me, behind it slow breathing. I didn't decide to move so much as snap. I grabbed the flashlight, shoved the zipper down with one hand and lunged halfway out of the tent barefoot into mud. The zipper snagged for one awful second on the sticky patch of sap at the pull, then ripped free. Cold mud hit the bottoms of my feet. My knees sank. I swung the beam up toward the trees. A figure stood maybe 25 feet away between two trunks. It looked like a rain poncho turned inside out, reflective strips facing outward in irregular bright bands that flashed back white in my light. The shape underneath it was human-sized but hard to read because the material hung wrong, stiff in places, clinging in others. The hood or collar obscured the head. I couldn't see a face. The person was just standing there, angled slightly toward me. I froze, not metaphorically. My body literally stalled in that kneeling position with one foot folded under me and mud soaking through one leg of my pants. The flashlight shook so badly the beam hopped from chest to shoulder to the nearest tree. My mouth opened and nothing came out. The figure took one slow step backward, not turning around, not breaking eyeline if there even was eyeline under that hood, just stepping back into the dark with the same calm control as the circling, as the knocks, as the whole escalating series of little tests that had brought us to that exact moment. Then another step, then it was gone between the trees. No crashing retreat, no sprint, just absence. I stayed there with the flashlight pointed at the space where it had been until my hand cramped. I don't know how long. Long enough for the beam to catch droplets falling through leaves like tiny bits of wire. Long enough that my toes went numb from cold mud despite the summer heat. Long enough to realize if the person moved again anywhere, I would not be able to tell from which direction. That realization broke the freeze. I backed into the tent, grabbed the dry bag with my wallet and keys, shoved on one shoe without untying it and carried the other, left most of the rest where it was and started hiking out before sunrise. The 6 miles back felt twice that. My shoulders burned from the lopsided pack. Rhododendron branches kept slapping my arms. Twice I had to stop because my vision narrowed so badly I thought I might throw up. When I got near the washed-out bridge area, dawn light had finally started turning the trail gray instead of black, and hearing the first ordinary bird calls again almost made me cry from relief. The rangers took the report in the patient, practiced way people do when they think there may be something there but don't expect to recover enough to make it solid. Their explanation was an unregistered transient camper moving between remote sites, maybe looking for unattended supplies, maybe trying to scare off isolated campers so he could keep the area to himself. No campsites had been officially registered beyond the washed-out bridge that week. No solid evidence besides partial prints recovered. That was the line, which is fair, honestly. A hidden trespasser accounts for the footprints, the flashlight, the moved objects, the breathing outside the tent. I don't need it to be anything else for it to have been bad. But the part I still can't fit into that explanation is the path of the shoe prints. Because the muddy footprints crossed directly through camp repeatedly without ever approaching the food bags or equipment worth stealing. They bypassed the obvious things every time: the pack, the food, the stove, the useful stuff. Whoever made them seemed less interested in taking anything than in moving through the center of my space and letting me discover that they had. That's the detail that keeps the whole thing from settling into a simple story about a trespasser. I went home and answered my family's calls eventually. I told a shortened version at first because I didn't want them attaching this to the other failure, like I was fragile now or incapable now. But the truth is that Tripp did something permanent to my body before my mind even caught up. For months, any soft tapping on fabric made my stomach lock up. Laundry brushing the hamper, a shower curtain shifting, somebody's hand sliding across a jacket in a store. I still camp, but not remotely, not alone like that, and never beyond closures no matter how ignored they are. The biggest thing, though, is stupidly specific. I can't sleep with tent walls zipped fully closed anymore. Even in cold weather, I leave the top cracked open because the feeling of enclosed fabric pressing inward near my face still takes me right back to kneeling barefoot in the mud, waiting for something in the trees to step forward again.